So I'm going to do what I always do in these circumstances and tell some stories, some of which will be historical in the sense that they relate to a community of practice of which, as Joran said, I was really a part between 25 and nearly 50 years ago, and others which relate to how I view that activity from my more recent perspective as an academic. I've written variously about this as a shift in technological infrastructures, from analog to digital, as a shift in aesthetics, to what I've called a post-acousmatic sensibility, and a shift towards ecosystemic thought, to a concern with the complex interrelationships between people, instruments, and environments in musicking. There's a sort of opening out involved there in the move between each of these, starting with a far too rigid, somewhat technologically determinist situation in which the composer's view was all important, a sort of modernism, moving to a more explicitly subjective position in which feelings and an audience contexts were shyly admitted, a sort of loose slide to the postmodern, if you like, and then into a sort of anthropologically inclined holism, in which the vagaries of unforeseen conduct, improvisation, and the unknowables of interpenetrating agencies of people, things, and ideas become the most interesting bit, the social context. I suppose it's a sort of growing up story. The longer you're about, the more you know you don't know. So the story will weave around and be indebted to a number of people who continue to have an influence on what I do and why, and who will appear at various points. One of these, Jonathan Impert, my colleague first at the University of East Anglia and more recently at the Orpheus Institute in Ghent, writes of what he terms second-order intuitive technology, arguing that for all its primacy in our thought, our habitual access to technology is poetic, through metaphors, rather than scientific, through propositional logic. I find this immensely reassuring, given that my own interest in intuition and improvisation with regard to technology is essentially pragmatic. It's simply a reflection of how I conduct myself and my sometimes less than adequate technical understanding. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, given that for considerable periods of our careers, Jonathan and I have kind of run in parallel, we share the view that, in his words, musicking provides a unique prism through which to re-examine our relationship with technology, both historically and in the present. So for a considerable period of my pre-academic career, my entanglement in music's relationship with technologies, reliant equally upon intuition and improvisation, was as an emerging electroacoustic composer in the UK in the early 1980s, here at my first St John Smith Square appearance in 1981 with Steve Montague, Nigel Osborne and Tim Souster. In fact, this was my London debut. More recently, my research has tended to suggest that we might learn something about current musical practices and how to organise them by looking at the older technologies which support musicking, in particular at musical instruments, at what these embody in terms of histories of action, in terms of engagements with material culture, and in terms of the patterns of social organisation of humans which they suggest or assume. So today I thought I'd retest my instinct that past conduct and material culture might disclose something persuasive and pragmatic for us now, that musicking does indeed provide a unique prism through which to re-examine our relationship with technology, by looking at a history of some technologised practices of doing music of the late 20th century, at the period during which musicians became sufficiently explicit that technology played an active role in their thought and conduct, that they began to refer self-consciously to music technology as a thing. As this maps rather conveniently onto my own past experience, I wondered whether an excursion through the changing studio practices of the 1970s to the 2000s might provide insights which resonate with what's going on in musicking a quarter of the way into this rather bumpy 21st century. And might the ways in which we organise technologically informed musicking have implications for other forms of social organisation, which might be useful, even crucial, right now. So I'm going to dive straight into what will be, for many in this audience, the foreign country of electroacoustic music making in the late 70s and early 80s, during which I first became aware of, and then formally involved with, the studios of the University of East Anglia in Norwich, of which I was later to become director. Some of it will be essentially a personal account, but I hope to regularly interrogate or at least reflect on the precise situations described in such a manner as to expose both fractures with and continuities in current thought and practices. So I'm going to start by talking about logistics, time and composing. Self-evidently, if one's working practice is dependent upon relatively high levels of supporting technology, one can only practice when that technology is available. Electroacoustic composition in 1980, as a species in the ecosystem of musical activity, was an extremely niche subset of an already minority field called contemporary music. And worse, it was dependent upon highly specialized conditions for its making. Typically, the minimum requirement might be for 5 or 6 stereo tape machines, a mixer and monitoring, and a selection of microphones, all of broadcast or professional quality. Some sound generating equipment might also be present. All of these were items of immense expense. Such conditions therefore existed in radio studios, a few universities, perhaps 4 or 5 across the UK at the time, and in commercial studios. As a freelance composer, working much of the time with contemporary dance companies, I had to compete for commercial studio time with bands sponsored by the music business, and the facilities offered by such studios were optimized for multi-track, multi-performer recordings, in which the technical roles of recording, setup and mixing were only very partially delegated to the artists. Instead, producers and engineers operated as part of a network of differently focused individuals with a negotiated shared goal. By contrast, electroacoustic composition, as Andrew pointed out, was predominantly a lonely business in which the composer took on all the roles. This conduct didn't easily adapt to the commercial studio environment, so increasingly I and a number of like-minded composers of the same generation took an interest in the few alternative working strategies available. For me, these were initially linked to invitations from composer studio directors from overseas who'd come across my music at festivals. In 1983, Lars Gunnar Bodin heard my work at the Bourges Festival in France and invited me to work at EMS, the Swedish National Studio. And from 1985 onwards, I spent numerous periods working there, and in regional studios in France. Barry Anderson, who ran West Square and Morley College studios, was also extremely supportive. But the real transformation of my practice took place when Dennis Smalley suggested that I enroll on a part-time PhD at the University of East Anglia, pointing out that the annual fee for such a degree was less than a fortnight's hire of a commercial studio. A glance at my schedules, here several blocks from 1985 and 1991, show that as a result I was typically able to spend more days in the studio than not. Although these diary entries, the yellow entries are all studio bookings, suggest an organised, productive individual with an impressive work ethic, the reality is that all working processes in an analog studio were extremely slow, often tedious, and one of the main imaginative efforts was in sustaining interest and momentum in the process of making work, rather than allowing the many purely technical distractions of the process to derail this. The technical standards of the UEA studio were legendary, thanks to a parallel master's degree course in recording, which was supervised by Trygve Tryggvason, an ex-Decca engineer with an extraordinary capacity to hear the slightest non-linearity in a recording process. At his insistence, all tape machines, and in general I was using 6 Studas, were cleaned, demagnetized and aligned each morning by the first user, a process which could spread over several hours, before a single sound was made. The process of putting together a piece was iterative, consisting of repeatedly searching through fragments of already pre-recorded or pre-composed material stored on small hubs, loading these onto the single flanged spools of the tape machines and rewinding them in order to play them. Tapes were always stored tail out to reduce the audible effect of print-through, magnetic transfer of the signal from the next winding of the tape, which built up over time in storage. At any given point, I might typically be concentrating on perhaps 4 filing cabinet drawers full of these fragments, which I identified as relevant to the current task, the piece I was working on. But the sorting and storage system was a fallible process, and frequently a foray into an irrelevant drawer of material produced the unplanned conjunction of materials which I had judged the work to need at that point. Coordinating the onset of multiple events, each loaded on a different tape machine, was aided by a crude remote control system. But just as frequently, I'd invite trusted friends into the studio to help with particularly complex mixes, often selecting the one that felt right in the act of doing, rather than the most sonically precise outcome. Mixing, here, might refer to putting together a small section of work, but equally might be about constructing a single complex sound object for incorporation into another subsequent mix. A 15-minute piece for dance might contain several thousand splices and many multiple levels of nested mixing, which might now be referred to as stems. So let's take a pause in this narrative and dig back into some of the ideologies and presuppositions here so far. The expense and scarcity of the supporting technology in the 70s and 80s limited it to institutions, radio stations, universities, commercial studios, meaning that most electroacoustic music, being essentially economically unviable, was carried out in the first two. Where habitual conduct in commercial studios was collaborative and team-based, electroacoustic music inherited the ultimately romantic compositional strategy of intensive solo work. It was structurally antisocial. Popular culture's strategies of production, though far from egalitarian, were at least social at many levels of the activity. Electroacoustic art music seemed to reify individuation through its working processes, with work only exposed to other clique members at selected concerts and festivals. In some respects, electroacoustic music at the time seems to embody modernism's configuration of the individual as efficient and productive, in that all available time is committed to it or to managing its technologies. But paradoxically, what is produced by this increasingly individuated practice apparently has a diminishing capacity to significantly inform communal sense-making. That I remember most clearly those periods of the composing where I was helped in the studio by others, or involved in exploratory playing and recording of what we describe reductively as small source material, by analogy with the raw materials of efficient productivity, might be interpreted as suggesting, especially in the light of the characteristically more communal practices of popular music culture, that solo studio practices, far from affording imaginative freedom, as we like to think, were actually injurious to it. That one of the key aspects of musicking suppressed by characteristic electroacoustic practice was the sociality of its making. The electroacoustic composer's role might be read as a limit case of the modernist musician, notionally responsible for all aspects of their signifying practice, no community required other than that of similar composers. Of course, this is mildly parodic, but we will revisit this sense that electronic music's history has been more exaggeratedly individual-focused than other practices, because it can be seen to have resonances later in the practice's development. Studio work in the 70s and 80s, however repetitive and sometimes boring, emerges also as intensely physical, involving the shifting and manipulation of vast numbers of objects around the studio space. The iterative coordination of the sounding material, the sounding of multiple physical tapes, often required dance-like planning and precision. Given plausible music's dependence on knowing when, memorably addressed by people like Joel Ryan, perhaps analog tape music's repertoire of temporal rhetorical devices might somehow have emerged from an actual physical logic, the pacing around the studio, and I use that word in both senses, pacing around the studio. In this regard, my current students' production of dance music on laptops while sitting on the floor in corridors forms another paradox. Music in which timing is seemingly everything emanates from nothing more visceral than the blur of fingers on alphabetic keyboards. Perhaps this is why so much dance music is literally gridlocked, meshed into an absolutely unvarying pulse. Of course, musical timings, knowings when, can be imagined, but something about the judgment of precisely the right timing is somehow made more assured if it's in the context of other movement. Perhaps this relates to David Sudnow's observation in his book The Ways of the Hand, that the micro-timing and varied weighting of jazz phrasing is somehow made possible by the apparently temporally unrelated rocking of the body, providing a reciprocal cycle against which to calibrate. Knowing when requires other activity against which it can correlate. Managing material. One of the logistical difficulties of composing in the pre-digital studio was of maintaining some sort of structural overview of the work and the relationships of its component details. More senior members of the audience will be familiar with strategies such as those illustrated, which represent some of my attempts from 1980 to 83 to manage the typically 500 or 600 spooled hubs of tape material, some representing entire precomposed sections, some still barely transformed source material with which I might be working at any given time. Physically loading each hub onto a tape machine and replaying it was sufficiently non-instant in its recall that sketches of gestures and pitch relationships could save huge amounts of valuable time. Other sketches performed more explicitly score-like functions, rehearsing potential formal structures, and investigating the temporal balance of functions. Investigating the temporal balance of different episodes in a larger time frame. These are often similar to the sorts of timeline-based solutions to which many composers resorted in order to note performance details for multi-loudspeaker diffusion. So that's one of my sketches, the so-called diffusion scores. Some of these graphic solutions predate the possibility of computer representation by nearly a decade, yet they adopt remarkably similar representational strategies. Once composers adapted to the convenience and genuinely instant recall of computer-based replay and assembly, they came by 1989 to rely increasingly on the visual feedback provided by amplitude plots in stereo editing programs like Sound Tools, and by 1991 by the schematic track and time representation of assembly and mixing environments such as Pro Tools, which was initially a duo of programs called ProDec and ProEdit. The increased speed of working afforded had a number of effects. Studio time could be much more productive in time management terms. It was no longer necessary or even justifiable for a studio to be occupied for 8 hours a day by a single user over a 4-month period to produce a 13-minute work. But this had aesthetic ramifications too. Faster working meant less time for internalization and critical reflection, both significant as mechanisms for filtering out less than adequate work. Typically, a late 70s or early 80s analog-produced work at UEA might have actively preoccupied its composer for half a year. By the early 90s, a month of concentrated studio work, with perhaps a prior source recording period, might have been regarded as adequate for the same task. I think there's a Dennis Smalley diffusion score there for you. Of course, the sheer level of exposure to one's own material necessitated by the labour of physical repetitions in analogue work led to a profound knowledge of and identification with the material. If I spool up anything from one of the 10 filing cabinets full of unresolved material I have from my analogue working period, roughly 1979 to 91, I can recall it and its making almost instantly. I can recognise any deviations from the original pitch or spectral balance, and often recall the context and process of its making and other people involved. The instant recall possible in the digital domain simply doesn't afford this sort of long-term absorption of sonic materiality. The relationship is changed by its speed. This prolonged contact and familiarity with one's own material, coupled with the block-like sectional structure of works encouraged by physical splicing, led to the tendency to mine material from previous works in new contexts. Here, material simply recurs across a number of works made fundamentally in the analog domain, but occasionally with DAT machines as a storage medium. And the oldest work is at the top, and you can see the trickle down of different material through these different pieces. To some extent, this self-quotation or reuse presages the current trend for versioning or patching, which is the digital domain's equivalent refusal of the fixity of the work. And here is later in digital domain, the sort of nested sections of material trickling down into the work at the top of the work. So it's the sort of structure based on the series of mixes involved in it. Again, a pause for reflection. All the language I've used here is functional. The business of composition is clearly concerned primarily with organising sound. Again, Andrew mentioned this. But it's also ideological. Talk of source material and sound objects, for all its apparent functional focus, is of course hugely concerned with abstractions, with parameters and processes as metaphors. Attacks, reverb tails, granular textures, spectra, and morphologies may seem to be objective. They're treated as palpable and absolute, but of course they're not. So if it's possible to identify a single crucial influence on or guiding principle for the direction and sensibility of at least UK electroacoustic music during the 1980s and 90s, it's the codification of spectromorphology as a defining discourse. Dennis Smalley's notion of spectromorphology, developed in the very early 1980s and formalised initially in Simon Emerson's 1986 book, The Language of Electroacoustic Music, was a precise but complex systematising of spectral movement over time, which brought together elements from his tenure in Messiaen's analysis classes and more obviously Pierre Schaeffer's phenomenological approach to sound. Spectromorphology was originally purely analytic or descriptive in purpose, retrospective. But its codification soon led to its adoption as something approaching a compositional method. Smalley returned from a visit to Sweden in the late 1980s, shocked that students had begun to use the terminology to justify compositional choices, which were paradoxically not sufficiently based on listening, something obviously very far from his intention. The language had begun to be co-opted as a compositional system, and soon a literature emerged celebrating correlations between spectromorphological terminology and particular works, often framed as practice-based research to assuage higher education's increasing demands for research outputs. In retrospect, though, I can recognise that the spectral sensibility into which I was guided by Smalley was as much a product of our shared interest in Rameau, in the flickering surface detail of historically informed performances of Baroque repertoire, as it was of conscious developments of Schaeffer's ideas. For all its abstractedness, the first waves of electroacoustic music in the UK were also highly aware of art music's history, and its practitioners were consciously concerned to tie their music to this axis, in contradistinction to experience with similar technologies in, say, popular culture. Electroacoustic music's aesthetics were still configured around organising sound, around the primacy of listening, of the acoustic fact, and this extended beyond compositional decision-making and had a profound effect on performance too. So I'll now talk a little about sound diffusion. The now orthodox sound diffusion system is the hereditary descendant of multiple loudspeaker systems for performance, which have their origin in French practices imported into the UK by Smalley. Although I'd always assumed that the UEA system, which began to be assembled in 1975, was modelled directly by Smalley on diffusion systems in France, this was not straightforwardly the case. Smalley recounts that he hadn't by then heard or seen the Acousmonium, the multi-loudspeaker setup at the Groupe de Recherche Musicale in Paris, and probably not even the Gamebaphone in Bourges, which supported the annual festival there, which was a point of pilgrimage for composers from Europe and further afield. Smalley had had conversations with François Bayle about it while he was at GRM working on Pont in 1974, at which point Bayle was talking about the setting up of the Acousmonium. But there were significant differences, however, initially most obviously of scale, between the French approaches and the UEA system, but more significantly for the aesthetics of performance in the arrangement of loudspeakers in the performance space. Whereas the GRM Acousmonium grew, as had the Bourges system, from an orchestral metaphor in which groups of loudspeakers were disposed in groups around the space, the discussion between Smalley and Bayle involved the idea of perspectives, of the need for a soloist, for a distant perspective and a close perspective, and of broadening things out from there. Smalley took from Bayle the creation of the trees of tweeters, the arbre of the Acousmonium. UEA's diffusion systems always involved a network of tweeters suspended above the audience area, although these were habitually arranged as a grid rather than the self-standing tree-like clusters of GRM's Acousmonium. Although Smalley's mention of a soloist might seem consistent with an orchestral metaphor for loudspeaker arrangement, the UEA system rapidly developed more of an expanded studio metaphor, in which wide and narrow pairs of loudspeakers mimicked the key stereo function of studio monitoring, and these were supplemented by a rear pair upward firing and therefore indirect side speakers, and a distant pair usually aimed at the rear wall. These full-range speakers were supplemented by bass bins, the tweeter grid mentioned above, and an additional pair of tweeters mounted very high, at 4.5 meters above the stage, directly above the narrow front pair. This had become more or less the default arrangement by 1980, and despite more than 3 decades of upgrading of loudspeakers and occasional positional variation, the accumulated knowledge of the principles of the system's operation, particularly in the home space of the school's 150-seat concert room, still made it aesthetically viable in 2010, 30 years later. The UEA system was the model for many of the UK's diffusion systems, including that with arguably the highest profile, Beast. An additional peculiarity or innovation of the UEA system came about from its early use in the Arts Council's Contemporary Music Network tours. These necessitated dismantling the entire main UEA studio in order to use the mixing desk, which in 1980 was a large, heavy Midas. Eventually, the level of disruption and the redundancy of most of the studio desk's facilities in performance led to the design and building of a dedicated diffusion console, an 8-in, 24-out passive matrix device with no EQ or preamplification, which enabled rapid, intuitive routing and level control of multiple channels of speakers. From this, it's clear that one of the technical requirements of work produced in the UEA studio was that they should translate, despite the differences in acoustic, from the relatively dead space of the studio to the extremely live space of the concert room, without the need for equalization. Smalley's teaching directly addressed the need for students to be aware of the effects of the listening space on the perceived result. The act of diffusing was explicitly regarded as performative, involving moment-to-moment adjustments, expansion through fader movements and loudspeaker choices of the dynamics and proxemics, usually expressed as perspective, of the sound. From this, key aesthetic heuristics emerged: that the studio mix should tend towards less reverberation than intended, to allow for the additional liveness of the room component; that composers should rehearse extensively with the system in the performance space, creating a timed diffusion score marked with guide settings which were designed to provide spatial and dynamic interest, irrespective of one's position in the audience. That's important. Although the precise nature of this interest would of course be different in each position. That subjective loudness could be decoupled from the number of loudspeakers in use. The tweeter grid and bass bins engaged at frequencies which became intuitively familiar to generations of composers, resulting in works which explicitly used spectral separation as a means of enhancing spatial separation, even though almost all the works produced were stereo. The tweeter grid in particular enhanced the decoupling of proxemics from loudness, allowing precise, close, high-frequency content to be added to, for example, quiet replay of material from the upward-firing side loudspeakers, the latter being inherently diffuse and lacking in high frequencies. The subjective result was a gentle, diffuse, full-range sound without any loss of clarity or physical closeness of high-frequency detail. Smalley's conception of the diffusion system acknowledged the privileged position of the composer, monitoring their work in a studio context, and although this was taken as ideal for the purposes of our initial judgment about the work, translatability to the differences of performance circumstances, the necessity to remodel the work for a particular environment, and more importantly, for an audience dispersed around the space, rather than sitting in a privileged listening position, were regarded as equally important. In this regard, the often tacit knowledge built up around how sound works in the unpredictability of changing environments, and listened to from multiple positions, was one of the socio-sonic skills which decades of theoretically inclined modelling of 3D sound environments has yet to emulate. I have yet to hear any solution, ambisonic, Atmos, or anything else, which gets anywhere near this sophisticated recognition of the different situatedness of each audience member in a free air performance space. Headphone-based solutions can be much more convincingly controlled, but then of course, almost by definition, these involve the social isolation of some kind. So if I've appeared a little bit grumpy with regard to the loss of knowledge of what one might call ecosystemic flexibility with regard to the spatial reproduction of sound. It's not out of nostalgia, but partly because composers of my generation were strongly influenced, too strongly influenced, by neutral models of sound spatialization, by regarding the movement of sounds and the direction from which they come as benign parameters, to be exploited as dramatically or expressively as possible. My more anthropologically informed instinct now suggests that a composer's interest might be better invested in creating place, of an inhabited, politicized, non-neutral character, which recognizes sound from behind, for example, as inherently threatening or destabilizing, rather than creating space, which is a blithely neutral phenomenon in which up is the equivalent of down, left of right, and front of back. Recent attempts by a Dolby Atmos technician to convince me of the viability of that particular spatial solution left me bewildered by the use of dramatic movement to compensate for lack of content, worried by the audible phase shifts which accompanied every sonic gesture, and anxious that those involved had self-evidently never actually listened to the sophisticated combination of stasis and slight movement which characterizes a real forest. Luckily, I have an unbroken 2-week-long high-resolution 24-channel recording of the Brazilian rainforest made by an ex-PhD supervisee, Pablo Sanz, to refer to if I want a genuinely patient response to this particular spatial problem. For me at least, where listening is concerned, generic and systemic solutions and impatiently created melodrama do not yet come close to ad hoc approaches based on slowly accumulated oral judgment. My own works since 2006's Proxemics, The World is a Deaf Machine, right up to the recent Line made for Turner Contemporary, serve as irritants to standardized models of the apprehension of surround sound. The former involving listeners with iPods and open-backed headphones moving within a ring of 8 loudspeakers, such that their individual material interfered with and completed the standing waves and other material external to them. The latter piece, Line, simply deploys small USB-powered speakers in a straight line, which is, in its own precise way, of course, as immersive in any real acoustic as a surround system. I won't go into these in detail, but you can find out about them on my website if you're interested. The last thing in this part of the talk I'll talk about is scale and resolution, the instrument-electroacoustic sound relationship. During the 1980s, working time in the UEA studios was shared between electroacoustic composition, usually a single master's or PhD student supervised by Dennis, and sound recording, again usually 1 or perhaps 2 master students supervised by Tryggvi Tryggvason. There's Dennis Smalley in the studio. As one of those early master students, I was in practice subject to a similar amount of input from each supervisor. Tryggvason recorded and produced records for the university's own record label, as well as being involved in freelance recording for major classical labels everywhere. His expertise ensured that the studio operated at the peak of technical excellence. It was one of very few universities affiliated to the APRS, Association of Professional Recording Studios, and was in some respects modelled on the successful Tonmeister course at the University of Surrey. Tryggvason's recordings were always highly regarded in reviews in the Gramophone, and his dedication to uncoloured reproduction of instrumental timbre was transmitted to the students, who were encouraged to regard the switches toggling between the main out and the tape return on the studio's Midas mixer as the key tools of oral critique. A newly aligned Studer tape machine with Dolby A noise reduction and new tape was, by general consent, capable of passing this elementary test. It was difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish with the monitors we were then using between live feed and off-tape signal. The difficulty came when a recording had to be copied, as all had to be after physical editing. At this point, the noise floor became audible, and slight compression of some aspects of the signal was discernible. Applying this principle to electroacoustic material with its inevitable multiple generations of processing and intervention meant that the dynamic range of material off-tape was further reduced. The goal of achieving sounds which appeared to transcend their origin in the loudspeakers, which was one of Dennis's phrases, was thus difficult. In contrast, the dynamic range of an acoustic instrument, typically amplified for contemporary concert material at UEA by using high-quality studio condenser mics, did not suffer from dynamic compression, but rather had its dynamic capacities incredibly increased by the forensic qualities of close miking. In this case, combined with amplification and loudspeakers which owed more to studio monitoring and high-end audio than to public address. The combination of amplified instrument and tape, a staple of competitions such as Bourges and of electroacoustic discourse, was therefore subject to a potential mismatch, in which the detailed and dynamic instrumental sound was simply not matched by the tape part, or if it was, by reliance on bold rhetorical gestures in the latter. The studio's acquisition of digital recording, initially in the form of the two-box Sony PCM F1 and its associated Betamax video recorder in 1981, changed this situation fundamentally. Dennis Smalley's clarinet threads, in a performance by Roger Heaton at the 1986 ICMC in The Hague, if anything tilted the balance the other way, so brilliantly characterised and virtuosically dynamic were they, that some audience members observed that the clarinet had seemed less than real. This was my first experience of a virtual sound world exceeding the dynamic range and spectral extension of the real in both directions. Doubtless listeners will identify their own historical moment at which this occurred, but the affordance by recording and reproduction technologies of a dynamic range and a spectral extension exceeding that of the real, what one might now term hyper-resolution, marked an important aesthetic shift for electroacoustic composers. So all of this is about sound, organising sound and sound qualities. And what I want to do now for the rest of the talk is to change tack and suggest that some of my implicit grumpy old man criticism of things changing for the worse has itself to be subjected to another critique, a critique of the ideology which informed this obsessive, individuated, beautiful, refined, but essentially socially disconnected, or at least socially unconcerned work, produced by the best of my peers in the 1970s, 80s and 90s. This was work produced under an essentially Kantian aesthetics, in which detachment is either a necessity or a virtue. I mentioned earlier that as students increasingly worked on laptops rather than the studio's master computer system, they also began to inhabit the previously individualized space of the studio in groups or clusters, often working simultaneously on different projects, but networked together, enabling collaborative or communal solutions to individual problems. The previously essential central focus of the studio's main monitors became peripheral. They were there to be referred to if required, but more usually everyone oscillated between headphones and the internal speakers of the laptop, using the latter for ad hoc communal demonstration and often sharing left and right earbuds between two adjacent listeners for an approximate shared listening. Discussing this with my colleague Nick Collins, he of the handmade music and hacking fame, a month ago, I began by bemoaning the difficulties faced by composition students now, of decontextualized instant access to all sound of any genre, period or culture, often of not particularly high audio resolution, or of knowledge gained primarily through YouTube videos, where visual content frequently eclipses or compensates for audio lack. But talking with Nick also made me hyper-aware that the two of us shared rather a lot of history. We were two white, male, academically based but not particularly academically inclined musicians, the wrong side of retirement age, both with inevitable levels of vestigial unreconstructed modernism. I had characterised instant access to MP3 audio as indicative of students listening to reminders of things that they already know and do not have time or interest to re-experience fully. But of course, we were both also alive to the possibility that these new practices in musicking may be the result of significant ideological changes, rather than merely insensitivities to audio resolution. These can be read more positively as a privileging of social situations over purely acoustic ones, and this is going to be my theme. Increasingly, despite my advice, my third-year Sonic Arts students monitor their compositions on laptop speakers rather than headphones or studio monitors. And they have moved from Spotify and Bandcamp to Instagram as the distribution method, embracing the latter's 30-second audio constraint as an indicator of optimal attention span, in much the manner of bands of the early 1960s constraining their output to conform with the new 45 RPM single format. This is an ideological change. It's about putting sociality before resolution. And it's uncomfortable for old fogies like me, who were brought up on audio resolution as a goal precisely because of its technological elusiveness, the difficulty of achieving it in the analog domain. Perhaps digital recording's forgivingness, its low noise floor, and its capacity to be good enough, ushers in a period where, for the better, musicking concentrates on social structures and their mediation rather than acoustic ones. Which brings me to the paradigm of live coding. In September 2021, I was privileged to hear the Colombian composer Alexandra Cardenas present her view of the live coding community at a seminar at the Orpheus Institute in Ghent. I should be clear from the offset that despite Thor Magnusson and Shelley Knott's best attempts to convert me, and despite some of my UEA graduate students' pioneering work in this area, the idea of watching lines of code appear on a screen as I listened wasn't something I found particularly enticing, and I was prepared to be underwhelmed. Within less than an hour, I had realised that I had, as so frequently, entirely missed the point, and that my criteria for engaging with live coding practice were entirely inappropriate. Here was an activity which provided a fierce and articulate critique of the orientation of musicking around the organising of sound. As I should have realised all along from my anthropological training, this was an activity which privileged soundly organised humanity over humanly organised sound. Paradoxically, an orientation for which I'd been both arguing and searching for years. Alexandra provided a compelling case that live coding started from the idea of community. Its concern with building local and online communities, digital and physical, is manifest in guidelines and codes of conduct, which emanate from the distributed, decentralised nature of the community, reflecting its anarchic, non-hierarchical ethos, in a subtly worded consensual structure for self-governance, which is consistent with the practice it supports, and exposes the process and experience of its co-makers. It's a hacked ethos, which values collaboration over the historicised conduct of composition. The rules of AlgoRave, or the GitHub guidelines for live coding, mark out communities which are facing head-on the difficult contemporary issue of how a community wants itself to behave, and what forms of regulation it's prepared to countenance to encourage such behaviours. As another coder, Rennick Bell, puts it, with disarming optimism, exposing process is part of the solution to our society's problems. Some of this concern for consensual regulated conduct grows from the community's strong connections with the online gaming community, who were early to realise the benefits of such self-regulation. I'm aware that some aspects of live coding's ethos, the instant real-time engagement, for example, may in some ways lie uneasily with my call for slow work, for inefficiency, for long consideration, for the extended thoughtful commitment recommended by John Bowers as a prerequisite for musically rewarding activity. Live coders share an ethos more akin to Instagram and TikTok than with the modes of making I appear to be espousing. But the collision of these different concerns is precisely what may invigorate and change musical practice. The first of George Lewis's 8 difficult steps for decolonialising new music is to move beyond kinship, to embrace difference as a means to avoiding the reproduction of likeness. As he notes, and this is key for me, institutions are technologies for reproducing unaltered social relations. I'll repeat that. Institutions are technologies for reproducing unaltered social relations. And this is as true of genres as of more formal institutions such as academia, festivals, and arts foundations. Electroacoustic music, you are also guilty. Lewis proposes a mental process of creolization as a means to allow musical practice to move towards a true world music, one not founded on Eurocentric impositions and assumptions. As contemporary politics makes us acutely aware, discourses of purity lead all too easily to their political equivalents, essentialism and fascism. Of course, I might have chosen noise music, or glitch, or lo-fi, or any number of other loose communities of practice as potential antidotes to the implicit ideologies of electroacoustic music. But none has quite the sense of originating in community building which pervades the live coding world. As will be becoming increasingly obvious, the trajectory of my narrative, which began in a historical, or albeit fairly recent and personal understanding of music, as what John Blacking referred to in the first chapter of his groundbreaking How Musical is Man as Humanly Organised Sound, is moving rapidly towards Blacking's final chapter, Soundly Organised Humanity. From George Lewis's call to creolized thought, it isn't a million miles to David Bell's 2014 writing on improvisation as anarchist organisation. Drawing on Christopher Small's by now well-established insistence on musicking as doing, that, to paraphrase Small, whatever meaning music has lies in the relationships which are brought into existence when it is performed, Bell points out that improvisation draws attention equally to the benefits and pitfalls of anarchist modes of organising. By framing his argument within a discussion of critical management studies in Ephemera, a journal on theory and politics in organisation, he attempts a creolisation of structures of social organisation which has value for music in general and in which he regards improvised music as playing a key role. The technologies we choose to use, including instruments and interfaces, and the situations in which we choose to use them are part of a process of continuous mutual reconfiguration. As David Borgo puts it, musicking can become a mutually constitutive process through which people, technologies, and environments are dynamically involved in configuring one another. My apparent sudden espousal of live coding as one type of social panacea isn't really as surprising as it seems. Much of my recent writing and research on musical instruments has bemoaned the extent to which the process of designing such instruments, DMIs, hyperinstruments, interfaces, whatever, has tended to focus on abstractions, such as reductive notions of gesture and control, configured primarily around making devices for individual users. The word instrument always needs to be followed by an of. We have instruments of death, destruction, and torture, and instruments of medicine, all of which involve considerable degrees of physical risk. Instruments of music might usefully, post Christopher Small, be redescribed as instruments of speculative relationality. The risk involved is social, trust, provocation, negotiation, consensus building. As I've written elsewhere, humans habitually use instruments to sense out, test, and probe the possibilities of self-other relations in dynamic, mutually engaging, and often playful and improvised behaviours. We can see this propensity for social structuring, for ensembling if you prefer, in the material culture around music, and particularly clearly in these instruments and technologies from other times and cultures, here recorded in the pages of Michael Pretorius's De Organographica of 1618 from his Syntagma Musicum, where families of similar instruments of different pitches replicate the pitch-quantized relationships between human voice types, while reinforcing their structural identity, the social ideal of differentiated but equal, consensual roles in musicking. Or in the siku, the panpipe of the Andean Altiplanos, where the notes of the scale are distributed in alternation between two ranks of pipes, ira and aka, played at least traditionally by two players. So to play a scale, you have to alternate between two people. Even the technologies of manuscript and printed table books of Elizabethan consort song, look at how they're laid out, or madrigal, configure through their layout a physical social interaction, a gathering around the table. So, of course, my suggestion for musical instrument design has been to reinsert it into the social context of its goal, musicking, to start from exploring or designing the sort of interhuman relationships we want to afford, and to work back from there towards instruments or other composing strategies for doing this enjoyably or well. I'm going to end on another note of hope. The certainties and privileges which were the precondition for the production of the sometimes beautiful but abstruse, privileged, and socially disengaged phenomenon of the electroacoustic music with which I began were, in no particular order, technological optimism, an establishment in which political and academic structures reified Eurocentric, partial, and colonial histories which effectively excluded dissent, criticality, or difference. A sense of capitalism as relatively benign, and of natural resources as limitless. 50 years later, all of these supposed stabilities are distinctly shaky, some of them thankfully so. But there has been one clear indicator of positive change. My graduate students, a good proportion of whom would, early in my career, have been content with making beautiful sonic objects, are now far more clearly focused on music's entanglement with social organisation, and with its capacity for critically exploring self-other relations. Though sound for its own sake may no longer be their concern, they haven't entirely lost an interest in its qualities, but they have become increasingly explicitly aware of music's capacity to initiate changes of thought or attitude, not least through an increasing and revitalised interest in the detail of improvised practices, of the way in which the things that we plan tend to transmute into what Lucy Suchman describes as situated actions, into muddling through, into improvised solutions. So while many of them have also continued to design instruments, they increasingly do so in the knowledge that, as my colleagues at SARC in Belfast, Matthew Roger and Paul Stapleton put it, the messy bi-directional influences between musicians and their socially situated contexts will disrupt any neat mappings between a musician's intentions and instrumental functions. So they move away from the idea that there might be a prototypical user, acknowledging instead the variability and difference inherent in different backgrounds, contexts, histories, and expectations. Some, like my current PhD researcher Adam Pultz-Melby, build vibrotactile feedback instruments. His is a double bass, incorporating sophisticated onboard sensing and algorithmic self-management systems, which learn from the work of Agostino de Scipio, but focus too on an exploration of the asymmetries in agency between self and instrument, in a sort of technological model of empathy. Others, like Hadi Bastani, engage with a community of practice in a country from which he is now a refugee, by using the networked video and audio technology which characterises his work and method of distribution as a research tool, a sort of virtual distant fieldwork. Adam Denton's work looks explicitly at how interventions, political, legislative, physical, often temporary, in the social space of the city might make conurbations more human places to live and work. Such spaces may be seen as symptomatic of an attempt to shift or undermine unregulated global economies. Conor Mccauley's work, even before his PhD, effectively involved trying on different selves as a strategy for increasing his own diversity of approach, a sort of critical autoethnography. From an intense study of 4 influential improvising drummers, he developed a strategy for exploring their techniques in practice, not with the aim of imitating their conduct, but to absorb aspects of unfamiliar techniques and physicalities to the point that they become embodied extensions of his own playing. Having listened to me talking for far too long, we'll end by watching an extract from this project and this process. Here we will witness Conor's gradual incorporation of the physical approach of drummer Chris Corsano, with a running commentary superimposed as part of the multi-layered self-analysis. He describes himself thinking not so much in terms of conventional percussion technique, but like a dancer, experiencing his playing as flow, or as, and this is a quote, bodily exploration of movement on top of, across, and within the interchangeable pathways of the drum kit. Physical restrictions considered, I tend to think of this style of playing as waves of circular phrasing, moving above, around, and passing through the kit, the presence of which is felt both in the feet, and at the arms and the hands, as well as the knees, chest, and stomach. The subject or object of fiercest interrogation always has to be the sense of self, and the cosy assumptions which accompany it. I hope fervently that there will be no more electroacoustic music, at least in the sense of the practice associated with the technologies and infrastructures presented in the first half of my talk, the historical half. I hope that what will be produced by the current generation will be far more interesting, far more diverse, will propose and negotiate new and different kinds of social formations, will not be about uniformity, but about acknowledging and dealing with differentiation and diversity, about making rich and varied ecologies of activity. Right now, I'm feeling pretty optimistic.
So we'll see at the beginning here quite a timid approach to exploring these new textures and sounds. I'm allowing time for my body to really process the physical and auditory response. Very quickly getting comfortable with navigating the territory. Nice stick push there to move the piece of wood out of the way. Already getting very comfortable. There's a fluidity and a cleanliness in the execution of phrases here. We'll see us start to explore other techniques like this drag across the rack tom, lifting the piece of wood here, manipulating the snare sounds. And then we see the hi-hat and rack tom stroke in the left hand. Here was explored in the Milford Graves research. And again, a very comfortable toss around the wood here. Already in quite comfortable territory. As I turn on the snare and the drum on the left, exploring its sonorities. Coming up here, we see an exploration of the castanets placed on top of the hi-hat. Something I've never seen anyone do before. Quite busy here, nearly up to Chris Corsano speed, but again, focusing on musical phrases, and then briefly coming back to center myself. Very comfortable throwing the sticks around the drums there. Between the two snare drums with both snares turned on, and depending on where the phrasing is going, the body seems to dictate the grip in the left hand. Quite a dry sound. Here I get into unison playing, a feature of Chris Corsano's playing. And then there's further exploration of this new approach with the castanets and the hi-hats and the wooden blocks. But take a look at the head sway here. Again, just a subtle habit that recalibrates my focus. And we'll see here a very comfortable throw of the wooden block onto the floor tom, opening up the tonality of that left snare drum. And I'm navigating whichever grip in the left hand feels best. And there's very interesting dialogue explored here. And again, very comfortable phrasing here, very fluid, very clean. Definitely I've seen improvements in the hands. Doubles here, and a very comfortable sweep there across the cymbals, across the kit. And right now it's a very good example of my approach to splitting the limbs and playing above and through and across the pathways of the drum kit. That was a comfortable pickup of the bell without interrupting the flow of play. Exploring further textures here, followed by a very subtle manipulation of the sound of the rack tom with the wooden block. Seem to have fallen into new territory here, and you'll see that I keep momentum going here on the floor tom whilst I reach for the brush. And this was something I initially found difficult, you know, making those transitions between the different tools of play but keeping momentum up. And here I'm exploring the classic Chris Corsano one-stroke roll in the left hand, definitely needs work. And also exploring the bell with the 2 drumsticks in one hand, something Milford Graves also did, making use of 2 sticks in one hand, but also a feature of Chris Corsano's play. And begin to explore the use of the 2 sticks on different surfaces of the one hand. And as we draw to a close on this video excerpt, we'll finish with exploring dissonances that arise from the resonation of the bell on top of the snare drum here. But this marks the end of this clip here for now.